international law states it's illegal, but I do know of
Okay,
certain
so
animal testing
you're
situations
saying
which are
so hold on.
illegal via
Which
international
specific
law.
animal testing are you saying is legal via international law?
Like animal
Well, it can be
testing,
all.
which
It
like
can be all animal testing, right?
that there are some animal testings which are legal via international law. Like as
Okay,
long as
so
it's
we both agree on that. Gotcha. That's great. We're having some progress. So we both agree. Me and you, we both agree right here that there are some animal testing which is legal. Now, when you're going to be talking about veganism and ethics and all of this stuff, right? You're saying finally they're unlawful animal testing. Now, is it the case that you're talking about this with respects to animal ethics in the context of veganism, or are you talking about it from a different context? Which one
I'm
is it?
talking about whether you think that there are some instances which are immoral or not.
Of course, I believe there's some instances which are immoral. So, for example,
Yeah.
if I steal someone's pet, for example, and then do testing on it, then that would be immoral because that's not good for the person who is the rightful owner of that animal. The rightful
What if
owner
it's
of
a
that
stray
animal did not
animal?
even consent to the action of
What if
you
it's a stray
testing on
animal?
that specific animal. Sorry, what?
What if it's a stray animal?
It depends on the animal. I think there's some animals which has these type of like facts
What
about
about vertebrate
the
animals?
I think there's I'm still talking. I think there's some animals which has some sort of like facts related to the ethical domain, which make it immoral to do such if they're stray. And I think there's some other animals which do not actually meet
Okay.
that criteria. Yeah.
Which animals?
Which animals? So for example, think of like a random ass, I don't know, like a squirrel, for example, or like a mongoose, for example. I don't care about those animals specifically.
Yeah.
Some types of
And
mongoose are
why
are
do you not
stray.
care about those animals?
Because the intuitions I have in my near psychological system does not give me the sort of like view that this thing would be immoral if someone is perform like some sort of like test on it. That's the reason,
Okay.
or even
And
kill it.
why do
Yeah.
you think? Okay. Why
Why
do
do
you
I think
think
my
like these?
intuitions are credible?
That's not what I was gonna ask. I was gonna ask, why do you think like these intuitions track like moral truths?
That's the same thing as what I just asked you. If you ask someone
It's
why are the intuitions in this context credible, you're asking them why is it the case that this intuition is good justification for the claim you believe to be true to actually be true. It's the same thing.
okay.
So you're like, oh, I'm not going to
No,
say
I
why
asked
this is
why
not
they track
credible. I'm going
moral
to ask you why this is
truths.
not credible. Yeah. So,
I
anyways, here's
asked
the
why they
reason as to
track
why it
moral
is
truths.
credible. Yeah, it tracks moral truths because of the fact that generally speaking, intuition tracks truths. So to say that it does not
You
track
can
moral
prove
truth
that.
is to make an exception, which
Okay.
makes the view
Wait.
less
Okay.
parsimonious by definition.
Okay.
There you
So
go.
number
Any
one.
response? Any other
Okay.
questions?
So
Do you have a counter
okay. So
argument?
num. Okay. Yeah. Just
What's your
calm
counter
down for a
argument?
second. Just calm
I'm
down for a
calm.
second so I
I
can
sound
actually
calm
speak.
right
Yeah.
now.
Okay.
I don't care about your
Yeah.
tone
Okay.
police and
So
strategies. I care about the response
okay.
to my
So number one, I
questions.
just
Yeah.
okay. I don't even know why you're doing this. Like, if you want to, like, I don't know
I'm doing
why.
this by pointing out your dishonest rhetorical devices you're trying to
Nobody
implement
was
here instead
being
of actually
dishonest. What the hell?
addressing my question. Yeah, you're trying to tone police
That's what I
someone.
was gonna
Yeah,
do, but you
it's really
kept speaking.
persuasive. Answer the question
That's
though.
what I
What's
was
your
gonna
counter
do, but you
argument?
kept speaking.
I
Yeah.
don't know. I
Okay.
meant
So
the
number
debate
one,
and
I
on
just want
Reddit.
you to
Just answer
prove.
the question.
So number one, I just
Mm-hmm.
want you to prove. I just number
That's
one.
not the counter
I
argument. You
just
said you
want.
had a counter argument.
Wait, what?
You said you had a counter argument. Now you're asking me questions.
Nobody said. No,
So you have more
oh my god.
questions. I asked
Wait,
you, do you
no.
have a counter argument? You said yes.
Yeah, I have a counter
And
argument,
then
but
you're
I'm gonna
asking me
ask you to
questions.
prove one of the claims that you made. Okay, I don't look. This is just getting like really, really annoying. You said I had. Okay, I said I had
You
a counter
tripped over
argument. I
yourself.
said
You
that.
realized you
Wait,
fucked up, and
okay.
now you're trying to run away
Wait,
from it.
wait, okay.
Let him speak. Holy fuck.
Free. I know you
Yeah,
wouldn't
I
be
said I
saying
had a
this if it was
counter
Tim doing
argument.
the same thing.
I said I had a okay. I said I had a counter argument, and I said that okay. I'm going to ask you to prove one of the claims that you made in your argument. Then I'll present the counter argument or why I
That's
think
not what he
the
said,
thing
but you
that
can
you said
continue.
is false. Yeah, but the
That's not
thing
what
is,
he
you
said, but you
didn't
can
let me
continue.
speak, so you wouldn't have known. You didn't let me speak, so you wouldn't
So
have even
what?
known
What's
that.
the claim you want me to prove, by the way? Just to be clear on this.
Okay, so I'd prefer not to be interrupted this time when I speak. Like,
I
can
don't
you
care about your
ensure that?
preference. If we're gonna make dishonest questions or dishonest claims, I'm gonna interrupt you the moment you start
Okay,
making
like
those
then we
factually
can
correct
just
ones.
okay. I
Or
don't
if
even
you want to do
like you just
talking stick, we can do a
you're not
talking
willing.
stick. Which one is it?
Yeah, so we can do a talking stick. Yeah, so you can get
Yeah, I have
any
no issue with
moderator
either.
who
But
needs
if we're
to.
gonna have a back and forth conversation, there's gonna be interruptions. Interruptions are normal and back.
Yeah, but this is like constant interruption. Okay, thank you, like the guy who muted him. And that was like constant interruption. Okay, so the claim that you made is that intuition's a truth tracking. So now the reason why I didn't want you to interrupt me is that I wanted you to prove that intuition's a truth tracking. Now, the reason why I don't think that intuition's a truth tracking, generally, especially if those intuitions aren't collective. It's just that our intuitions are going to be formed by certain evolutionary traits that we have, or certain environmental traits that we gain or that we have, that ensure our survival. But it's not always the case that our intuitions, which ensure our survival, are going to be the intuitions which are also truth tracking or actually track real moral truths, or real truths in general. And so that's the reason why I'm going to ask you to prove that intuitions are truth tracking. Now, even if you do prove that intuitions are truth tracking, you'd need to prove that we have like this collective intuition that things like squirrels or mongooses, like we don't care about them, like they're morally insignificant or morally irrelevant to us. That's just an intuition that you have. So to say that like your specific intuition is truth tracking does not matter to me, because I can also say that I have an opposing intuition and that intuition is also truth tracking, but that wouldn't matter to me, right? Because you have to prove that this intuition is a collective intuition and that collective intuition is truth tracking, not just that the intuition itself is truth tracking. Because again, you said that intuitions are truth tracking. But according to that view, if somebody had an opposing intuition, or if a collection of people had an opposing intuition to your intuition, that intuition would also be truth tracking, which also can't be the case because two opposing intuitions, which express two opposing propositions, can't be true at the same time in the same sense. And so you have to prove that your specific intuition is truth tracking.
Yeah, so I don't know why I got muted when there was like no agreement on talking stick. Well, he got muted afterwards, so I guess there's just talking stick from now on. So just to address a couple of things, yeah, there's nothing about someone saying intuitions are truth tracking that they have to appeal to a collection of intuitions. So, for example, if you're the only person that exists in the world, right, let's say like every single human being and every single species got genocided, and you're the only person in the world or on the planet which exist, right? And there was to be like a random question that you saw somewhere in like some book, and the question was to be like, if it is the case that you were to have like a 9-year-old kid that exists, would it be okay for it to like sexually assault a girl? The answer is no, and you're gonna have the intuition. Now, obviously, in that case scenario, the intuition you have as to why that would be immoral would still be good evidence for why it would be, even if there are no other persons with the same intuitions. So appealing to the idea that hey, there are no other persons with the same intuitions, there are no collective intuitions, doesn't disqualify from being like strong evidence, right? Because like even in the case scenario where we have just one person on the entire planet, it's just one moral agent. If that person was to have the intuition that genocide in a particular nation or Africans are to be immoral, that intuition in isolation would still be strong fucking evidence for the claim. Moving on to the other part, there's nothing about what I've said which indicates that I have to basically appeal to other people's intuitions or basically demonstrate as to why other people agree with my intuitions, right? Unless it is the case that there's in fact some firm fact which establishes that it would be something which does in fact exist, and by that thing I'm talking about a set of opposing intuitions, or rather the idea that there is in fact just as much people, if not more people, who disagrees with my intuitions, then it will be the case that further evidence will be required. But until then, it is not the case that any sort of like further evidence is required for the claim. Right. So do you want to establish that specific oppositional intuition, or do you want to just basically retract and not make the claim that there are oppositional intuitions, which would fit a phenomenal conservative model, thus making my claim justified?
Okay, so yeah, so I take it that you're asking me to like establish or articulate the opposing intuition that's towards your view. And I think I've already articulated the opposing intuition that's opposes your view or your intuition. Now, like I can give you empirics for why like a certain collection or quite a lot of people hold this intuition, which to me, if quite a lot of people hold the intuition, that would to me raise the probability of the intuition being true, or the intuition being truth tracking, rather than only one person holding this intuition, but for some reason nobody else holds this intuition. It seems much less likely that that intuition is true than the opposing intuition, which many more people hold. Now, I can present the empirics for why many more people hold that things like squirrels, things like mongooses are morally relevant, and we can't just do all of these actions that we generally see as like morally reprehensible to things like squirrels and mongooses, and we still have to consider them as things which can be harmed, at least, or things which can have morally reprehensible or morally heinous actions done unto them. Now, um, this example, or the example that you gave to me earlier, was just irrelevant because what you said to me was that intuitions are truth tracking. Now, given in this world, there is a collection of people, so not in any hypothetical scenario, but in this world, there is a collection of people. That statement seems to say that the intuitions that we generally have are truth tracking because you did not specify that my intuitions are truth tracking, which, if you did specify, would make the conversation much easier. You said that the intuitions in general are truth tracking. So it's unclear what you mean there. Obviously, if you say the intuitions are truth tracking or intuitions are truth tracking, that seems to imply that the intuitions that people generally hold or that are shared among a collection of people are truth tracking rather than your own individual intuitions. Now, the hypothetical that you gave to me again does not even respond, or it doesn't even adequately respond to what I'm saying. Because again, in this world, there are multiple people. I don't care if you think that there's some hypothetical world where there's only one person and that intuition is truth tracking. What we're talking about now is this world and whether the intuitions given society or whether the intuitions given that this world exists are true, not whether the intuitions given some other hypothetical world that exists are true. And so, again, you didn't say that my intuitions are truth tracking. You just said that intuitions are truth tracking. And I'm waiting for the evidence. I'm waiting for the justification where you actually establish that intuitions are truth tracking. Because again, like you've had your response, but in your whole response, you did not actually answer the question. You didn't actually satisfy the burden of proof, which is that about the claim, which is that intuitions are truth tracking. So I'm waiting for when you actually provide the evidence or argumentation for why intuitions are truth tracking.
Just kind of crazy to me how you like basically spend like a whole bunch of like time just saying a whole bunch of nothing, right? So about the intuitions being true tracking, it being true tracking is more expected under the evolution theory being correct. So that's just going to be one piece of evidence, right? If intuitions were to not be true tracking, and we know for a fact that intuitions are the types of things which basically guides your actions, insofar as you have sensory intuitions, we use our senses to navigate the world itself. If those intuitions were to not be generally accurate, it would be less beneficial towards your survival because it would basically prevent us from actually knowing what the facts are and what would in fact harm us as biological organisms. So it's more expected, given the telos of evolution theory, that the intuitions, which obviously are developed from evolutionary processes, would be the types of things which are true tracking. That's the first evidence. That's the first evidence, which is from the field of evolutionary biology. The second evidence for intuitions being true tracking is from the field of neuroscience. So in neuroscience, it's established that intuitions has what is called sensory motor grounding in the brain. Now, sensory motor grounding is basically the description of case scenarios where you have a specific thing which is grounded by past experiences. So that means for any intuition acts that we have, which we believe something to be true, it is grounded by past experiences, meaning that intuitive beliefs, ceteris paribus, is going to be justified by inductive justification, thus making them more likely to be the case, thus making it true track. So I presented two pieces of evidence from two different fields of studies. The first one being evolutionary biology, the second one being neuroscience. Now I can present more evidence from intuitive physics and from mathematics and from the consistency of the real world, whereas the intuitions are pragmatically impactful to demonstrate why intuitions are true track, which first and foremost, I didn't have to do any of this stuff. The reason being that you quite literally granted on the same recording, we can roll back the clip afterwards, you said intuitions are in fact true tracking, but you don't have to agree that it is true tracking in the domain of ethics. So you've already conceded that intuitions are true tracking, realized that this agreement fucked you over, and so you're now retracting the concession, trying to backpedal on that point to basically question the evidence for that being the case. But unfortunately, facing the best fucking debater who knows what the fuck you're talking about, so I can present the studies demonstrating as to why they're true tracking, and I always have evidence for my claims. Unlike you, for example, just squirming away from giving evidence for your previous claims. Last but not least, you talk about the idea of collective intuitions and etc. I'm saying that when your response, in your objection, in your oppositional rebuttal towards my point, what you stated was that my intuitions would have to be demonstrated to conform with the collective intuitions. That's not the case. It could have it be the case where this one guy in the planets, Apollo, he basically has the intuition that X is wrong. And every other person on the planet has basically they have an intuitive state which is neutral insofar as they don't have the intuition to believe that this is something which is okay, and they don't have the intuition to believe that this is something which is not okay. It's epistemically neutral. Just that one intuition in isolation would still be good evidence, right? Because outside of that specific evaluation or evaluative assessment in that specific domain, it's established across different fields, across different interdisciplinary studies, that this thing is in fact true tracking. So yeah, that doesn't work, Rizzhan. Uh, well, I guess I said that was the last point, but really true, that wasn't really either the last point. You made another point regarding the squirrels thing. You have not established any sort of like oppositional data, which should give us good reason to doubt the intuitions I have. We can also say that generally speaking, in the society we live in, things which are vocalized to be immoral, or well, things which are immoral are the types of things which are vocalized to be immoral. We don't vocalize the idea that testing squirrels or these mongooses, for example, is immoral. So more likely, given this sort of modus tollens argument, it would be the case that it is not something which is deemed to be immoral, nor is it something which is in fact immoral. Right, so that's it.
Be free, Rizzhan! Go forth and multiply.
Yo, Rizzhan.
Yeah, you can
Your mic's supposed to be going green. Fucking idiot.
send off, yeah, bro. Yeah. So, anyways, just to respond to some of the things you said. So number one, I never even said that intuitions would be truth tracking, not just that, and that you'd have to prove that ethical intuitions are specifically truth tracking. That is not what I said. What I said specifically is just that maybe I could like grant that intuitions are truth tracking, given that most people in society have that intuition, right? So maybe I could grant that. So, but the problem is that if you just say that your intuition is truth tracking, and you say that the reason why your intuition is truth tracking is because of these sensory modalities, or like maybe like an evolutionary theory. So like Alvin Plantinga gives like the parenting argument against naturalism, and in the parenting argument against naturalism, he basically says that okay, it seems like our intuitions would be truth tracking because the best intuitions that would help us survive would be truth tracking intuitions, right? So like maybe you could say something like that, but that assumes that most people in society, or a good amount of people in society, have that intuition, which is why I'm asking you to prove. It seems that most people in society actually do not have that intuition, um, especially since we normally consider things or actions, for example, abusing or mutilating a squirrel to death. If somebody caught you mutilating a squirrel to death, think that they'd say, okay, you're not right in the head, like you need to get help. Like isn't a moral action. No matter how you think that the squirrel has less moral value than the human, if somebody literally found you mutilating a squirrel to death, they say, okay, you probably should get help. Like that is not a good action to do. You probably shouldn't mutilate squirrels to death unless you have like some overriding reason to do so. If you don't have like an overriding reason to hurt this squirrel, just leave the squirrel alone. I think most people would agree to that principle. Most people would agree to that intuition. However, you haven't presented any evidence for why people would agree to the intuition that um, squirrels are morally irrelevant and that we should, even if we don't have any good reason to, we should have the ability to hurt these squirrels and to harm these squirrels. You haven't like provided any evidence for why that intuition is a widely held intuition. Now, the implication for your view is just that if this intuition is not a widely held intuition held by humans, that seems that the intuition does not actually come from evolution, because evolutionary intuitions seem to be intuitions that are instantiated in most people, right? And so we can come to the conclusion that it's not an evolutionary intuition, meaning that your whole argument, which tried to show that, well, given evolution, this intuition probably is truth tracking, fails because it's not a collective intuition. It's only an intuition that a few people or one person has, right? And so you wouldn't be able to use any sorts of evolutionary arguments to somehow come to the conclusion that this intuition in particular is truth tracking. Now, to respond to like the sensory modal arguments you gave, like about how our senses track truths. Um, I'll just disagree with that because it seems that sensory modalities, so things like sensory modalities, um, most people agree on cross culture. So like they're cross culturally reliable, right? So most people agree on like basic visual or auditory experiences. For example, like most people agree that the sky is blue. Most people agree like the sea is blue. Like most people agree on those, right? But it seems that more complex intuitions, right? So intuitions about morality, intuitions about metaphysics aren't cross-culturally reliable. So they seem to be the ones that most people disagree on, or they seem to be the ones that are only instantiated in people given the type of culture or type of society that they've grown up in, or surrounds them, right? And so it seems like we can make a distinction between basic intuitions and instincts and complex intuitions and instincts. So these intuitions about whether mutilating squirrels or whether harming squirrels is morally permissible seems to be a complex intuition that we have about morality rather than a simple or basic intuition. Because again, it seems like there's this trend between the complexity of the intuition and how many people agree on it. So if an intuition is really, really complex, if an intuition has many, many niches and nuances about it, it's most likely that this intuition is going to be a intuition that is disagreed upon with most people. So most people have varying intuitions about what is moral in that scenario and what is not moral in this scenario. However, the more simple the intuition is, more people will actually agree that this intuition should be held or this intuition is true, right? So simple intuitions that we can easily observe, but like the sky is blue, right? But it doesn't seem that whether the fact that squirrels can be easily that should be mutilated, or it's more permissible that squirrels to be mutilated, and that doesn't seem to be an intuition that is evident to us via experience. And again, sensory modalities seem to um, be intuitions that are evident towards via basic experience, right? But obviously, these intuitions aren't going to be evident to us just from experience. Like, we have to do some investigation and some experimentation with the intuition to actually find out whether the intuition is true or not. So those two arguments you gave are just redundant unless you can prove that the intuition there is held as collective. And then um, I also had to like go for like 30 seconds or a minute while you were speaking. So like after you spoke about like the evolutionary thing, I didn't really hear what you were saying. So you probably want to repeat that. But I'm not sure if you had said anything else of value, right? So again, if like you want the empirics, why most people probably hold that we shouldn't mutilate squirrels and like it's not morally permissible to mutilate squirrels, I can give that to you.
I'd just like to note that that was approximately 6 minutes of speaking time.
Holy fucking shit. So just to respond to the couple of things you've said, so the evidence for intuitions being the types of things which are from evolution, by the way, if you're saying they're not from evolution insofar as they're not causally grounded in evolution, that's not the case. The reason as to why it would actually be causally grounded from evolution is because intuitions is a is a something which is generated from neurochemical releases, right? It's something which is a process of the brain. Okay, so anything which is a process of biology is going to be grounded in evolution because, as established by biology and the fields of sciences, we as human organisms comes from evolution. We are evolutionary grounded, or rather, we're grounded in some sort of evolution process, which means that it would be the case that the organism process, the biological process which comes with it, like us having intuitions, would also come from evolution. So that point is false. Moving on, the intuitions part regarding the true tracking nature of it. If you agree that it is genuinely true tracking, which I've established it to why it was, and you consented and agreed to this point, then it would be the case that that's inductive evidence for it being true tracking in this particular instance, right? Because of the fact that if you're going to say that it is not true tracking in this instance, then you'd have to postulate a exception to the rule of intuition being truth tracking, which entails your position being less parsimonious. So the evidence works in my favor, makes it objectively more likely. Third point, regarding you basically yapping on about like the whole idea of the censor argument. You think that it is not the case that their censor intuitions are generally accurate, which is absolutely ridiculous, right? Like you're basically telling me here that like, you know, in most cases when we're like using our senses in the world to navigate reality, the beliefs we come or we arrive at as a result of the senses or the types of things that are inaccurate. Well, first and foremost, I just take senses and sensory intuitions to be basically identical because when we have sensory experiences of a particular object, there's an immediate receptiveness that this object exists. And so, if you're going to say that sensory intuitions are not accurate, generally speaking, then you'd have to say that majority of empirical claims are not accurate. Majority of empirical claims, which by the way are fundamentally grounded in empirical intuitions, will not be accurate. And remember, your argument was primarily based on empirical surveys. You said you had like some sort of empirical study which demonstrates that people would actually have opposing intuitions. So that would just fuck up that argument insofar as the bare foundation for that argument that you would succeed is something which you disqualify from being a good evidential standard. So just to wrap things up, you've not proven your specific point as it pertains to you have not even taken a stance, rather. You ran away from the stance, from taking the stance on the position of animal exploitation, and more specifically the point I made about squirrels. And you have also failed to successfully debunk and undercut the credibility of my arguments, insofar as me presented multiple studies from different fields to which we inevitably agreed on, and also demonstrated as to why the claim that the intuitions in this case are not from evolution is a false claim. That's it.
Okay, yeah. The
That
Apollo
was
didn't
3 minutes,
actually,
by the way.
yeah,
That was three
yeah.
minutes.
Apollo didn't actually track what I said in the argument I gave, and I know like the argument was a long argument, but at least like take some notes. So nobody said firstly that sensory intuitions are not truth tracking. What I said specifically is just that intuitions or moral intuitions about whether squirrels should be mutilated or not, or like the moral permissibility of mutilating and beating up squirrels is an intuition that is not a sensory intuition. And so whether sensory intuitions to me, whether sensory intuitions are truth tracking or not, is not relevant to the claim that I'm making because I'm making a moral claim that doesn't seem to be simply deduced from the empirics or from the sensory like data or the sense data that we get from the specific situation, which is why I made the distinction between simple and complex intuitions. Intuitions that we have about sensory data or our senses are simple intuitions. They're immediately verifiable, they're things that can be immediately perceived. Whereas more nuanced intuitions about morality or about metaphysics or about ethics are more complex. Now, I said that this claim has a substantive amount of explanatory power because it explains why in different cultures people will have different moral intuitions or why our moral intuitions evolve over time given the type of society that we live in. But it also explains why sensory intuitions are not the type of intuitions that evolve over time, whereas intuitions about morality are the type of intuitions that vary between different cultures, different societies, and seem to be the intuitions that actually develop over time. So again, whether sensory intuitions are true tracking or not is not relevant to the claim because I'm not making a claim about sensory intuitions. I'm making a claim about moral intuitions. And so I never even said that sensory intuitions are not truth tracking. That was just a blunder and a tracking error from you. Okay, so now to go on to like the whole point about evolution, the whole argument he gave about evolution is just false, right? Just because some intuition comes from like the brain states or the neurochemical processes happen in our brain does not mean that the intuition comes from evolution. Again, okay. So just take this. Take rapists, for example, right? Like take people who like to involve themselves in heinous acts. A lot of them have the intuitions and they have the neurochemical brain processes which tell them that the things that they are doing aren't wrong. So things like murder, things like abuse aren't wrong. However, you wouldn't say that that intuition is from evolution. No, you just say that this evolution is from this specific person's brain, um, and it's generated by some kind of fault that they have in their neurochemical processes, right? And so this is similar to the situation that I'm providing, right? So obviously, I might be able to grant that intuitions do come from our neurochemical processes, but that's not the same thing as me committing myself to the fact that intuitions, or all intuitions themselves, are going to come from evolution, right? I think I'd only be committed to that fact if the neurochemical processes that go on, whether when we're thinking about like the morality of whether squirrels should be mutilated or not, whether we're thinking about the morality of that action, I think that I'd only grant that if most people had the neurochemical process that corresponded to that intuition. However, again, you have not proved that most people have the neurochemical process that correspond to that intuition, right? And also, intuitions aren't just demonstrated, aren't just like contributed by our neurology, right? So there's also environmental factors which are going to influence our psychology, our phenomenal states, which then generate certain intuitions. So again, how we develop in a society or what society we live in will have a massive impact on the intuitions that we have growing up and going into life. It's not just going to be like our neurochemical processes intrinsic to themselves. No, there's going to be other extrinsic factors which are necessary for determining why we have certain intuitions and why we don't have certain intuitions, right? So again, it's not just our neurochemical processes. I don't even know why you made that claim. Um, and so, yeah, you still haven't demonstrated that these intuitions are from evolution, because for these intuitions to be from evolution, the intuitions would have to be held as collective. But it's more likely that if you're in the minority of people that hold an intuition, that it's most likely not from evolution, and it's most likely just from either some fault in thinking that you have, so some fault in your neurology that you have, or the type of society that you've grown up in. Now, again, this claim has much more explanatory power than simply just saying that, oh, your specific intuition that very few people hold comes from evolution. For some reason, um, like 90% of humanity, which have also gone through evolution, don't hold this intuition, but like your specific group holds this intuition. It's most likely just to say that your intuition is an anomaly and your intuition is just generated by the type of society that you've been brought up in, rather than saying that, okay, this intuition is a type of intuition that has actually come from evolution.
Yeah, so just to wrap up a couple of things, you have not addressed the arguments regarding the idea that if something is a biological process, then inevitably it's going to be something which comes from evolution, because evolution is basically the kicking point and starting point for biological organisms, including human beings. Intuitions is something which is a biological process, so it would inevitably be something which is causally grounded by evolution, the process of evolution. So that's something which has not been addressed. You did, in fact, make the claim that sensory intuitions are the types of things which you would not grant to be genuinely true tracking. Now you're saying you did not disagree with it, and you agree with that claim because you realized you fucked up again after presented further evidence which demonstrates why it was true tracking after you try to ride out and be a slime of fucking rodent on that point. Thirdly, as it relates to the idea of you talking about how that does not actually relate to moral intuitions, the idea is even if you were to basically mention or establish two different taxonomies or categories of intuitions, it doesn't mean that you cannot use one pool of intuitions to make some sort of inductive case for the other pool of intuitions being something which is accurate. That's retarded. Inductive cases are not necessarily disqualified based off differences between the observations or the specific data pieces. It's disqualified based off if those differences is going to be something which decreases the probability of something or some probability impact on the data, or it is the type of thing that you have some sort of overwhelming reason or some undercutting reason which would basically disqualify the inductive argument from being a good evidence. Basically, just to wrap things up, the inductive arguments have given succeeded and so forth, me establishing the vocalization of these sort of people and using this to be something which is evidence against them believing that in the case of squirrels, this would be something which is moral. People generally speaking don't vocalize their opinions on whether or not it is immoral to do animal testing on mongooses, for example. You want to talk about intuitions? Clearly, every single person acknowledges that it is something which is pragmatically useful for us to use animal testing for the sake of understanding humans' biology more because we have similarities and commonalities with animals. Right? We acknowledge this. Every single person knows for a fact, unless they're not educated, but every single person knows for a fact that how we have this level of knowledge we have currently on human beings and the biology structure of human beings is based off the fact that we have that sort of knowledge for animals. We use animal tests and empirical studies about the animals specifically to gain this sort of like predictive knowledge of human beings' organism structure and process. So the whole idea of appealing to popularity as a means of justification, or the intuition part, really doesn't work in your favor. And also the argument of giving the Moses tolerance argument, which is the idea of there being a correlation, a connection between that which is ethical, or that which is ethically intuitive, and that which people would vocalize, basically, given the fact that it is ethically intuitive, is something which goes against your favor, right? For most things which are ethically intuitive, right, people would basically vocalize, like for example, if it is ethically intuitive to believe something is wrong, they would vocalize this in society. They would make, like, for example, a campaign, for example, or they'd make this clear so that people stop doing this. But we don't see that in the case of like people doing animal testing on mongooses, for example. No one gives a fuck about mongooses, generally speaking. So more than likely, this is not the type of thing which is ethically intuitive. Given that Modus tolerance argument, so P implies Q, not Q different, not P. So that claim is proven. Regarding my fundamental claim of the intuitions part, you've not demonstrated the latter. You've not debunked the argument about the evolution point or the true tracking point. You granted the idea that intuitions are true tracking, and you also agreed on the idea that sensory intuitions are generally true tracking after you originally denied or neglected this proposition. So you conceded on one proposition, failed to justify another proposition, and failed to attack the credibility of my proposition. So you've lost this entire debate. Please stop yapping for 7 fucking minutes straight. It's gonna actually prolong my freaking responses because I have to respond to all the nonsense you're fucking spewing out of your anus right now. I'm done talking.
That was cold.
Is it a bit?
Midway through, wait, hold on. Midway through clowning him for speaking for a long time, he also
Wait, hold on. Midway through planning is.
Shut up, man! Shut up! Anyways,
Yeah.
Rizzhan, go on. Slaughter
Yeah,
him.
thank you, bro. Okay. So like number one, like he just didn't track the basic claims I was making. So in the original argument response, okay, I don't know who this guy is. Can
Hey,
somebody mute him?
brother.
W fucking Apollo. W fucking Apollo.
Wait, can somebody, yeah, just mute that guy. Also mute this Poochie guy. I don't know why that guy's talking. Anyways, in the original argument that I gave, um, for the sensory intuitions point, literally already said to him that sensory intuitions are going to be the type of intuitions which are cross-culturally reliable. Again, he did not track this. I said sensory intuitions are going to be cross-culturally reliable given the simplicity of the intuitions and given that these intuitions are easily confirmable. So we can literally just confirm them by observing our surroundings. They're easily confirmable, they're easily accessible. The evidence to prove that these intuitions are truly easily accessible, it literally just comes from looking up. It literally comes from basic actions that any human can do. Hence why sensory intuitions are generally taken to be cross-culturally reliable. Now, I said to him that things like ethical intuitions or things like metaphysical intuitions are most of the time not going to be cross-culturally reliable because a lot of the time ethical intuitions are formed of how we're raised in society or are formed based on our environmental response, our responses to the environment around us. Now, given that different people are going to be raised in different cultures, different people are going to be raised in different environments, it is expected under my hypothesis that most people are going to have conflicting intuitions about complex ethical issues. Now, I told him that our intuitions about things like whether mutilating squirrels is morally permissible are going to be things that are complex because they are nuanced. They have many areas of them in which we have to consider a large amount of evidence. Whereas for sensory intuitions, we don't have to consider a large amount of evidence. It's something that's easily verifiable. Whereas for things like complex ethical intuitions, they aren't easily verifiable. It takes contemplation and it takes convergence over a wide range of evidence in favor of both positions. Hence why there's going to be this fundamental distinction between sensory intuitions and ethical intuitions. Hence why any inductive case that you try and use to say that, oh, okay, since sensory intuitions have this quality, our intuitions, our complex intuitions are going to have this quality, would just be false because there's a fundamental distinction in how these operate, on how these intuitions operate and how these intuitions function. So again, you would not be able to use an argument like that. Now, just to provide the empirics that actually verify my claim that we should not, or we have a moral obligation to not mutilate squirrels or to not beat up squirrels, just to provide the empirics. Okay, so there was a 2021 YouGov survey. Um, in Britain and America. So 71% of Britons think that animals deserve similar protections from harm as humans in many cases. 70% of Americans oppose animal cruelty even if it benefits humans. And then there was also a 2019 YouGov poll. Over 80% of respondents in both the UK and US say it was wrong to hurt animals for fun or without cause. Now that's simply just the claim that I'm making. I'm making the claim that if we do not have any overriding reason, if we do not have any good reason to hurt or harm these animals, then we ought not hurt or harm these animals. I don't see how that's even a controversial intuition. That's an intuition that most people share, a collective intuition. Now, I'm saying that the implications for his argument implies that, okay, only a few people hold these intuitions. And if only a few people hold these intuitions, that decreases the probability of that intuition being something that is found in evolution. Because we expect that if it was an evolutionary intuition, that most or nearly all people would hold the intuition unless they had some mental deficiency or unless they had some chemical deficiency in their psychological or brain stage, which caused them to have like an opposing view. But the statistics actually only imply that the minority of people hold the intuition that he's trying to advocate for. And if the minority of people hold the intuition that he's trying to advocate for, that to me seems to imply that this is an evolution. This is a type of intuition that is not found in evolution. So this is a type of intuition that isn't gained from evolution. Rather, this is the type of intuition that is gained from the type of society or the type of cultures that we're up into, since different cultures and different societies are going to have different outlooks on the claim. Now, he said I didn't respond to like his whole biological processes point. Well, okay,
Hello,
so his whole biological processes point is just a
it's
misunderstanding.
3 p.m.
Um, wait, bro, so don't go on mute,
No.
bro. We can, yeah, don't go on mute. But his whole biological processes point is just a fundamental misunderstanding on how intuitions work, right? So supposedly, um, all like the processes that happen within our bodies, all the processes that happen within our brains are biological functions or are biological processes that we undergo. But just because it's a biological processes or biological function, it doesn't mean that the intuition is going to be identical to like the biological process. So it might be the case that we have the same biological process in two humans, but given certain external factors about how these biological processes were formed, they generate different intuitions, right? Unless Apollo was to make the strong claim that intuitions are identical to the biological processes, meaning that if we have two of the same biological processes, they cannot give rise to different intuitions. Unless he was to make that claim, which obviously the claim is just trivially false, given the data that we have about biological processes, um, then maybe the argument would be undermined. But if you were to simply just say that these intuitions are functionally reducible, so there's a type of functional dependency between the intuitions and brain processes, then it's perfectly reasonable to say that the same biological process in two humans can generate different intuitions, right? So even if the biological process comes from evolution, it doesn't mean that the intuition consequently generated by the biological process is also going to be something that comes from intuition. No, that's just a faulty argument that he's made. And again, he said that, oh, I ran away from giving a position. I already gave the position. So my position is just that we ought not, uh, or we ought not harm certain vertebrate animals, or we ought not harm all vertebrate animals if we do not have good reason to do so. So that's simply just my position. And in this case, mutilating a squirrel for absolutely no reason, obviously, um, would just be the thing that violates this principle. And so that action would be morally wrong. And that again that conforms, sorry, with the statistics that I sent earlier, or that I articulated earlier.
Well, you never sent proof of those stats even existence. That's number one. So just teachings is right there. Number two is you talking about the idea of the intuitions part. No, I'm not favoring my position. Is actually something which has been debunked repeatedly in this conversation. So that's just something I need to stress on that much because I'll give it the modus tollens argument, which basically demonstrates my claim being the case. The point you made as it pertains to the whole idea of like mutilating scrolls and all of that stuff for no good reason. I never specified that I believe that it would be okay for no good reason. You were talking about animal testing. Animal testing are usually for the sake of understanding and knowing the animals better as well as the human's biological structure better. So it wouldn't be relevant to the case of testing an animal in the case of like the context of when scientists are doing animal testing, for example, in a stray squirrel. Now, the point you're making as it relates to the idea of you saying that you supposedly demonstrated as to why the evolutionary argument was something which is unsuccessful is not even correct. It's told you repeatedly on numerous different occasions as to why it follows from evolution being the case that you would in fact have these sort of biological processes being a byproduct of evolution because biology and biological organisms, the very existence of biological organisms, which inevitably creates biological processes, comes from evolution. You granted this point, you agreed on that part. So there's no other argument you could possibly give to basically disqualify that from being the correct claim. Now, moving on from that, the whole, I could say, I mean, so you've given the intuitions part, that failed basically because it demonstrates the latter and you've not shown the statistics verifying that claim. You've talked about the idea of the evolution part, that also failed given the argument of just recapitulated in this debate. And regarding the idea of the principle you're appealing to, which is we ought not to hurt these sort of vertebrate animals without any sort of good reason, it begs the question insofar as it assumes that there's no good reason in the case of mutilating a squirrel or a mongoose, for example, right? Whereas, and I think that there's some case scenarios where preferences or, for example, preferring to do something is a good enough reason to do an action or to make an action permissible. And in some other cases, it is not the type of thing which makes an action permissible. So, for example, I think that if I prefer to go to the mall, then that's a good enough reason to make it morally permissible for me to go to the mall. There's no sort of like issue with that reason, which would make it the case that going to the mall is something which is morally impermissible. And I don't believe at the same time that appealing to the same standard of preferences to basically, you could say, school shoot a basic school, for example, like do school shooting, for example. Right? I don't think in that particular instance it is something which makes the action morally permissible. So I think you have to basically be careful on the types of standards. In some cases, the preferences are sufficient for it to be a good enough reason. In some other cases, it is not sufficient for it to be a good enough reason. So it really depends on the context. So with that being said, you'd have to prove that there's no good reason to do animal testing, even if that reason was to just merely be based off the fact that I want to do it to these squirrels, for example. That's something you have not verified. So a bunch of unverified, unsubstantiated, and you could say baseless claims that are not supported by the evidence on your end. Whereas you can't say the same for me because I've presented the studies, the fields rather, and the argument, the justification for all of my claims. And I've also demonstrated as to why you've conceded multiple points as a result of backpedaling on points you have agreed on verbatim and then lying about the fact you've made this agreement originally. So that's really just it. Can they just wrap this up? Like, I mean, this has been going for too long. Pretty sure the audience is being bored out.
Okay, yeah, like we can wrap this up after I respond to some of the things that you said. Because obviously like some of the things that you said were just quite absurd to me. It's like again for like the biological processes point, you just repeated yourself. I already told you how if there is not a strict identity between the intuitions and the biological processes, it's feasible and it's reasonable to say that the same biological process in two distinct individuals, given that there are external factors which influence these individuals and influence these biological processes, it's reasonable to think that if there's not a strict identity between the biological process and the intuition, the biological process can um, bring forth the different intuitions from varying people, right? Given that there are these, given that there are these other factors that are also influence biological process. Sorry, I just saw something in chat that tripped me up. Um, Poochie, I don't even know why you'd send that, but I don't even know if he's here. I don't know if he's here. But yeah. And then to respond to like the point about like the whole animal testing thing, I sent some of the statistics in chat if you want to scroll up and find those. So like most people in the US, most people in the UK believe that we should phase out animal testing, that like animals deserve like the same rights as us in animal testing. And if we are to animal test, then we have to have these very strict regulations which ensure that the animals either do not sustain any harm at all or are minimally harmed by the certain methods that are used